At the center of the Sahel, where sunlight does not simply warm the land but presses down like molten brass, there is a silence that carries weight. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of waiting. The silence of soil split open from months without rain. The silence of a farmer standing over a field where maize should rise above his shoulders, yet finds only dust and memory. For generations, families in Burkina Faso have lived with this quiet strain. When the rains failed, they did not look only to the clouds. They looked to the horizon for trucks. White trucks. Aid convoys carrying sacks of grain stamped with foreign flags and distant logos. Assistance arrived with ceremony, cameras, and promises. But when the dust settled, something deeper remained untouched. What happens when a nation grows tired of waiting for rescue? What if the help offered was never designed to build strength, only to manage weakness? Picture a village at dawn. The red earth cool from the night. Smoke rising from small cooking fires. A young mother kneels beside her hearth. Four children sit behind her, bowls in hand. Her garden once fed them. Now the soil is thin, exhausted by years of chemical fertilizer purchased on credit. The pests have returned. Again. She was advised to buy stronger chemicals. To take another loan. To follow the modern method. Yet her grain store stands empty. They called it development. The paperwork called it support. But the ledger told another story. Each season began with borrowing and ended with repayment. A cycle that never closed. Over time, she began to believe the label placed upon her. Poor. Dependent. In need of instruction. Until a young officer in a red beret refused to accept that script. Ibrahim Traore did not emerge from European lecture halls or global policy forums. He came from barracks where dust-coated boots and reality could not be filtered through theory. He had seen remote villages struggle without attention. He had watched farmers negotiate survival season after season. He understood a truth many policymakers ignored. A country cannot call itself free if its food depends on permission. This struggle was not only about crops or trade. It was about dignity. About whether a people stand upright even when the ground burns beneath them. To understand the rise of Traore, you must first understand the shadow he stepped out of. For 6 decades, the relationship between West Africa and the global North followed a predictable rhythm. Aid flowed in. Raw materials flowed out. Advice arrived packaged as expertise. Dependency settled quietly into policy. Burkina Faso, land of ancient empires and skilled cultivators, became a project site for NGOs. The narrative rarely changed. The soil is inadequate. The climate is harsh. The farmers lack knowledge. The solution must be imported. Imported seeds that could not reproduce without repurchase. Imported pesticides that killed beneficial insects alongside pests. Imported systems that dismissed indigenous practice as primitive. The damage was not only economic. It was psychological. When a grandfather can no longer teach his grandson how to restore soil because the new system requires certification, licensing, and credit from foreign banks, something fractures. Knowledge that sustained communities for centuries becomes labeled obsolete. The nation was fed, perhaps. But it was hollowed. Traore recognized that the most dangerous threat facing Burkina Faso was not drought alone, nor insurgency. It was the internalized belief that survival required foreign approval. The global crisis exposed the weakness of the imported model. Supply chains faltered. Fertilizer prices soared beyond reach. What was presented as modern efficiency revealed itself as fragile dependency. Farmers stood in fields stripped of nutrients and faced markets they could not afford. In that moment, Traore made a decision that startled diplomats. He did not ask for expanded credit. He did not petition for new aid packages. He looked down at the red soil and chose to trust it. Years earlier, stationed in rural provinces, he had observed something overlooked by experts. Elder women tending small gardens without synthetic sprays. They rotated crops. They composted. They balanced animals and plants in quiet coordination. Their yields were modest, yet stable. While global forums debated satellite monitoring and high-tech agronomy, Traore considered a simpler ally: the chicken. To international observers, the announcement sounded naive. 1 million chickens distributed across rural communities. Critics laughed. Commentators framed it as symbolism without scale. But the strategy was not symbolic. It was biological. The fall armyworm and locust do not attend conferences. They devour crops. Traore understood that nature had already designed a counterforce. Each bird would serve as mobile pest control. Self-replicating. Low cost. Locally managed. No foreign patent required. No imported debt attached. When the first crates arrived in villages, skepticism mixed with curiosity. Children chased birds through compounds. Farmers watched closely. The chickens scratched at soil, consuming larvae hidden beneath the surface. Damage slowed. Crops recovered. The soil began to breathe again. What appeared simple concealed layered economics. Each hen produced eggs. Each egg represented protein for a family or income at a market stall. Droppings enriched fields naturally. Pest control reduced chemical purchases. Risk diversified. One bird became dozens. One household gained resilience. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of families, and the model shifted from experiment to movement. This initiative did more than target insects. It challenged an entire economic architecture built on dependency. If Burkina Faso could reduce reliance on imported fertilizers and pesticides, multinational corporations would lose a captive market. Progress, for decades, was framed as something flowing north to south. Traore reversed the direction. He placed faith in local ecosystems and local hands. As aircraft from foreign capitals reduced frequency and official rhetoric cooled, another sound grew across the countryside. Wings. Thousands at first. Then millions. Yet reclaiming food is only the first battle. Holding independence in a world of giants presents another challenge entirely. As the sun sets beyond Ouagadougou's outskirts, a new question rises. Can a small landlocked nation sustain defiance without collapse? The laughter from distant capitals never touched the villages. On the ground, change was visible. Households gained new income streams. Women, often managers of small livestock, became central actors in economic revival. A dozen hens under a woman's care meant autonomy. Eggs sold for school fees. Surplus traded for salt, soap, grain. Aid distribution hierarchies were bypassed. Empowerment grew not from policy documents but from backyard enclosures. Meanwhile, soil composition shifted. Years of synthetic nitrogen had hardened fields, stripping microorganisms essential for fertility. Chicken manure restored organic matter. Fields softened. Moisture retention improved. The land ceased functioning as a chemical experiment. It returned to being a living system. The message sharpened. African ingenuity requires recognition, not replacement. But global systems resist disruption. As Burkina Faso reduced chemical imports, pressure mounted. Credit lines tightened. International institutions expressed concern. Investment flows slowed. Sanctions were whispered. Independence carries cost. The paradox deepened. Internal progress triggered external isolation. Success threatened established norms. Traore entered a new arena. No longer confronting pests in fields, but confronting structures built over decades to ensure compliance. In Ouagadougou, tension thickened. Declining foreign credit tested urban sectors dependent on imports. Spare parts grew scarce. Medical supplies tightened. Critics predicted failure. Yet instead of fracture, something hardened within the population. Youth organized cooperatives. Urban gardens emerged in unused lots. Poultry initiatives expanded beyond original targets. Distribution networks once plagued by corruption were replaced by local alliances. Isolation forced introspection. Introspection uncovered capacity. International headlines spoke of crisis. Villages spoke of ownership. Neighboring populations observed closely. If one nation could challenge economic orthodoxy, others might reconsider their own arrangements. Multinational corporations funded studies predicting ecological harm. Reports warned of declining yields. The language of environmental protection shielded commercial interests. Traore responded with transparency. Observers were invited to inspect fields. Health data from rural clinics showed improved protein intake. Household debt declined. The confrontation was no longer technical. It was philosophical. Is development measured by foreign approval or domestic stability? Each egg sold at a market became more than nutrition. It became a statement. A refusal to outsource survival. Yet challenges persisted. Climate change advanced desertification. Regional insecurity threatened borders. Independence did not eliminate adversity. It redefined response. The population no longer fought solely for administration. They defended a reclaimed sense of agency. Resilience ceased to be charity delivered. It became muscle strengthened through practice. Across Africa, questions multiplied. If Burkina Faso could reduce dependency through ordinary means, what other countries had overlooked within their own ecosystems? The dismantling of a century-old narrative began quietly. Not through speeches in grand halls, but through feathers scattered across courtyards. The legacy of Ibrahim Traore will not hinge solely on tenure or rhetoric. It will rest in farmers who no longer calculate planting decisions based on fertilizer subsidies from abroad. In children raised with the knowledge that their country feeds itself. 1 million birds were not an end. They were ignition. The risks remain. External pressure persists. The global order seldom applauds defiance. Yet a shift has occurred. A nation once described primarily in terms of crisis now defines itself through capability. The story is not romantic. It is arduous. Sovereignty demands sacrifice. But the red soil of Burkina Faso holds a lesson. Freedom is not delivered. It is cultivated. And sometimes, the first step toward independence arrives on two legs, scratching at the earth. As the poultry initiative matured, its deeper architecture began to reveal itself. What appeared at first as a rural agricultural program was becoming a structural redesign of national resilience. The million birds were no longer an isolated policy. They were nodes in a living network that connected soil, household income, nutrition, gender power, and national psychology. In village after village, the rhythm of daily life shifted. Morning routines expanded beyond crop inspection. Families now tended coops. Children collected eggs before walking to school. Women gathered to exchange feed techniques and breeding strategies. Informal knowledge circles formed beneath neem trees where elders discussed compost ratios and pest cycles. What foreign consultants once charged millions to analyze was being mapped organically through lived experience. The circular economy Traore envisioned began tightening its loops. Chickens consumed crop pests. Their manure restored soil structure. Revived soil improved yields of millet, sorghum, and maize. Increased harvest reduced reliance on imported grain. Surplus eggs generated income. Income financed school fees and reinvestment into small livestock expansion. Nothing existed in isolation. Even waste became input. Economists who once described Burkina Faso as structurally dependent were forced to reconsider variables they had ignored. Dependency had been measured in trade flows and foreign exchange reserves. They had not measured dignity. They had not calculated reduced anxiety in households no longer waiting for fertilizer subsidies. The psychological recalibration proved as powerful as the biological one. For decades, development language framed rural populations as beneficiaries. Now they were architects. That subtle shift altered posture. Farmers no longer asked, "When will assistance arrive?" They asked, "How do we scale what works?" The answer began forming through cooperatives. Local poultry groups pooled hatchlings and resources. Small feed production emerged using local grains and agricultural byproducts. Informal savings circles converted egg sales into microcapital. The million birds multiplied, not only numerically but institutionally. But transformation rarely advances without friction. Urban elites, accustomed to imported goods and stable foreign supply chains, felt the pinch of tightened international credit. Spare parts for machinery grew scarce. Pharmaceutical imports slowed. The tension between rural renewal and urban discomfort sharpened debate inside the republic. Critics accused Traore of romanticizing subsistence. They argued that modern economies require integration, not retreat. That autonomy without access to global markets risked stagnation. The leadership faced a defining choice. Compromise reforms to ease elite pressure or double down on rural sovereignty. Traore's response was calculated. He broadened the agricultural revival into a wider industrial conversation. If poultry reduced fertilizer dependency, what other sectors could reduce import reliance? Small-scale processing plants for grain and poultry products began appearing. Cold storage facilities were constructed using local materials. Training programs focused on veterinary science and soil microbiology emerged within domestic institutions. The aim was not isolation. It was recalibration. Burkina Faso did not reject trade. It rejected one-sided vulnerability. Meanwhile, foreign ministries watched carefully. A successful self-reliance model in one Sahelian state risked spreading. Mali and Niger observed with interest. Youth movements across West Africa amplified the narrative of food sovereignty. Social media replaced diplomatic cables as the medium of inspiration. The Sahelian alliance strengthened not merely through security coordination but through shared economic philosophy. Conversations shifted from aid packages to resource management, from dependency metrics to production capacity. Pressure intensified accordingly. Sanctions hardened. Certain financial transfers faced delays. Development grants were reconsidered. Reports questioning democratic processes circulated widely in international press. The subtext remained clear: compliance restores comfort. But compliance would have meant reversing internal gains. Inside Burkina Faso, something unexpected unfolded. The attempt to isolate the nation catalyzed innovation. Urban agriculture expanded dramatically. Rooftop gardens appeared in Ouagadougou. Youth engineers developed low-cost irrigation prototypes using recycled materials. Community grain banks reduced seasonal volatility. Scarcity forced creativity. International observers labeled the economy fragile. Yet rural surveys indicated improved protein intake, reduced debt burdens, and stabilized crop yields. The paradox confused analysts trained to interpret growth only through GDP expansion. What if stability measured differently? The most profound shift occurred in narrative ownership. For decades, Africa's story had been narrated externally. Crisis framed headlines. Aid framed solutions. Now a counterstory circulated. A small landlocked country challenging agricultural orthodoxy with chickens and compost. The symbolism traveled farther than policy memos ever could. Multinational agrochemical corporations faced declining market share in segments once considered secure. Lobbying intensified. Think tanks published cautionary briefs warning of a regression. Language shifted from development to risk management. Traore avoided rhetorical escalation. Instead, he invited empirical scrutiny. Soil samples were shared. Yield comparisons published. Public forums opened for debate. The argument remained grounded in outcomes rather than ideology. At the same time, regional insecurity persisted. Insurgent threats along northern borders required military focus. Critics predicted divided attention would weaken reforms. Yet soldiers deployed to rural areas witnessed the agricultural revival firsthand. Morale improved among forces whose families directly benefited from food resilience. National defense and food sovereignty became intertwined narratives rather than competing priorities. Climate change continued its advance. Desertification edged southward. Rainfall patterns fluctuated unpredictably. No poultry initiative alone could halt ecological reality. Recognizing this, the administration expanded agroforestry programs. Tree planting integrated with poultry systems. Shade improved soil moisture retention. Leaf litter enhanced compost production. Restoration thinking extended beyond immediate pest control into long-term land regeneration. Step by step, policy matured from reactive defiance to systemic redesign. International tension remained. Trade negotiations grew tense. Some neighboring governments, wary of antagonizing larger powers, distanced themselves publicly while observing privately. Inside Burkina Faso, patience was tested. Inflation pressures touched imported goods. Urban dissatisfaction simmered intermittently. Opposition voices demanded reintegration into established economic channels. Traore framed the debate bluntly. Short-term comfort or long-term autonomy. He argued that sovereignty resembles muscle. Underused, it weakens. Exercised, it strengthens. The first repetitions are painful. As years passed, data began supporting his gamble. Fertilizer imports declined significantly. Rural household debt reduced. Poultry populations exceeded initial projections. Local feed mills expanded employment. Secondary industries, from egg transport to coop construction, generated ancillary jobs. The ripple effects extended into education. Agricultural science enrollment rose. Students sought training in soil biology and livestock management. Knowledge once dismissed as backward regained prestige under scientific validation. The transformation was not uniform. Some regions struggled with distribution inefficiencies. Disease outbreaks among poultry required rapid response and veterinary infrastructure scaling. Lessons were learned through error rather than grant-funded pilot programs. This authenticity carried weight. The international order, built upon predictable trade patterns and dependency loops, found itself confronting an uncomfortable precedent. If self-reliance proved viable at scale, leverage diminished. Each successful harvest deepened the tension. Yet perhaps the most profound change was internal. Citizens began to view themselves not as recipients but as stewards. That shift cannot be sanctioned. Burkina Faso's experiment became a living referendum on 21st-century independence. Could a nation redefine development outside inherited templates? The answer was unfolding not in conference halls but in courtyards where hens scratched at red soil and children carried baskets of eggs to market. The million wings had not merely disrupted pests. They had unsettled assumptions. And as the horizon glowed each morning over the Sahel, the silence that once signaled desperation carried a different tone. It no longer spoke of waiting. It spoke of work.